Okay, welcome everybody to our session on Sri Lanka. My name is Jivanta Schottli. I am the director of the Ireland-India Institute. Thanks very much to all of you who've joined today and to our speakers who I'll introduce to you very shortly. So first of all, today is actually a joint webinar event between the Ireland-India Institute and the Institute for International Conflict Resolution and Reconstruction. These are two research bodies, research institutes at Dublin City University. And from the point of view of the Ireland-India Institute, our effort has always been to do events, especially now during the pandemic, and that's been an advantage for us in some ways to have more webinars, to bring in people from South Asia, of course, relying on their generosity with their time, but to bridge the gap between academia and praxis. And I think our speakers today are just wonderful examples of that in their own lives and in their own careers of having done that combining of both. So let me just begin by welcoming our two speakers. We have with us Dr. Dushni Weerakoon, who is the Executive Director of the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, an autonomous economic policy research institute in Colombo. Dr. Dushni is head of its macroeconomic policy research. So it's wonderful to have someone who can probably explain to us the ins and outs and the nitty-gritties of economics, but having read some of her work, I also know she can speak to the non-economists, so that's also a great benefit for us today. She has published widely on trade policies, economic issues, regional trade integration, and international economics, and has extensive experience in public policy engagement, having served in many national regional bodies. Then we have Dr. Jude Fernando, who is assistant professor in the School of Religion at Trinity College in Dublin and director of the Trinity Center for Post-Conflict Justice. He too brings a praxis-based experience to the academic context with an interest in the area of interreligious studies and international peace studies. His main research interests have been religion, peace, and conflict, looking at interreligious dialogue and peace building, ethno-nationalism, geopolitics, focusing on Sri Lanka, and I believe drawing a lot on the experience of Ireland. And he's co-authored two books. Both our speakers have multiple publications, which I'm not going to go into, but urge you to look at their bio data and their respective institutions. So once again, thank you so much for your time. Today's topic, we're going to be looking at the crisis, which has gripped our attention for the last couple of months. And you know, it sounds more and more dramatic, but at the same time, you can see how the institutions are coming into play and the role of individuals. And so we also want to understand the way forward and how to get out of the situation and hopefully some positive steps ahead. So please, Dr. Dushni, I'll hand over to you for about 15 minutes and then invite Dr. Jude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jivanta. I'm not going to make it a very technical presentation, but I will share some slides because I think that makes life a little easier for me in trying to explain some of the economics behind it. Okay, I don't know if I can share the full screen, right? Okay, so you know, the Sri Lankan current crisis, it's essentially, if you look at the roots of it or the proximate cause of it, is that we decided about a decade or so ago to go heavily into foreign borrowing from international capital markets, as well as from new lenders like China, and Sri Lanka was no exception. There were many other emerging markets that also sort of ventured into capital markets after the global financial crisis. Global interest rates were low, and if you didn't have sufficient domestic resources, then it at that time made sense to borrow some of the shortfalls from these new sources. Now, we started around 2007, but this process accelerated after the end of the war. In 2010, the government decided that it was going to embark on a very ambitious infrastructure program, and they used this foreign capital that they could tap get that process moving. Now, the problem is that when you have these kinds of foreign borrowing, there is a tendency to rely on an assumption, and sometimes it turns out to be a false assumption that you can refinance and roll over your debt repayments. And this is pretty much what we did. So if you look at these, the black and the grayish lines, that's the amount of foreign borrowing that the government did each year. And the orange bar is the amount of debt repayments that we had to make. So we borrowed in excess of what had to be repaid. But when you have a external shock like COVID, and the macro environment starts to deteriorate and your sovereign credit rating starts to plummet, then you find that you essentially get frozen out of access to such forms of capital. So 2020 and 2021, you can see the debt repayments far exceed the amount of capital inflows that came into government hands. And this situation was worsened by the fact that, Sri Lanka didn't really have strong sources of its own foreign exchange earnings. That, if you can see, this is the export earnings over the last decade. It's fairly flat. Remittance earnings is another major source, and of course tourism that picked up after the end of the war. But in 2019, tourism earnings also started to decline after we had a major terrorist attack in 2019. So again, with the pandemic, tourism earnings collapsed. Remittances started to shrink. So the foreign exchange shortfall began to become rather acute. Now, these initial sort of weak conditions that we were faced with were compounded to a large extent by a series of policy blunders in managing this economic shock. First is that, if you look at on the fiscal side, Sri Lanka's always had very weak public finances, but it became really bad in 2021. Revenues dropped sharply, and that's really not only because of the pandemic. The government also, we had a change of government in end of 2019, and the incoming government, came on a very populist mandate. They decided to cut taxes sharply, and through the weakening of public finances as we dealt with COVID, the government was very stubborn that it was not going to revisit its tax policy and start thinking about raising taxes so that the public finance situation would worsen. So the deficit is in double-digit figures, around 13-14% of GDP. Now, I think even in many parts of the world, central banks started to print money, provide direct financing. Now, in advanced economies, you can do that because you have convertible currencies. The euro is a convertible currency, the dollar or the Japanese yen, but Sri Lankan rupee is not a convertible currency. So when you start to print money in large quantities to finance your expenditures, it has inevitable impacts on the exchange rate. It puts the exchange rate under pressure. So again, policy blunder here. What the central bank did was to fix the exchange rate for a considerable period of time to try and control the impact of that money creation on the exchange rate. So you can see the exchange rate is held at an artificially pegged to the US dollar, even as Sri Lanka's reserves started to decline. And suddenly in March, when it became obviously apparent that this policy can't be continued, the central bank again decided to float the currency, and then the rupee shot up and has since depreciated by about 80% between March and May of this year. So within a couple of months, huge depreciation of the currency has taken place. All of these have combined to push up inflation in the Sri Lankan economy. Again, inflation is now at about nearing 25%. This is because of the huge liquidity injections into the economy, the depreciation of the currency. Sri Lanka is a net importer of food and fuel. So when you have a depreciation, it also has pass-through impacts on prices. And then we have supply side disruptions. Again, there was a government policy decision that we were going to overnight transition away from use of chemical fertilizer to organic farming. And now this is something that you can't do overnight. And it led to a huge shortage of fertilizer in the country, and food production is now down by about 40% because of that policy decision, though it has since been reversed. And of course, global commodity prices also started to increase, oil prices, etc. So the combination of these factors meant that we had a shortage of dollars, so we couldn't import essentials, gas, fuel, milk powder, medicines, and we started to have queues for whatever limited supply of these products was available in the markets. And the huge the shortfall in fuel meant that we also started to experience power cuts. At its worst, it was 14-hour power cuts each day, and the cost of living pressures all spilled over into public and political unrest on a scale that we have not seen for decades. So that is sort of the where we hit bottom in terms of the economic crisis. So some degree of competent macroeconomic management, I think, would have allowed us to avert a severe crisis of this nature that we're experiencing now. Of course, we would have gone through a fairly challenging economic set of conditions, but still perhaps not to the extent that we are seeing now. Now, one of the key issues was that policy corrections called for fiscal tightening, that is either to cut spending or raise taxes or both, move to market-driven interest rates and exchange rate. That means essentially driving up interest rates. Now, for governments in the middle of a pandemic and the economic fallout that we were experiencing as a result of that, and on a populist platform, these policy choices were not very attractive because higher interest rates would squeeze growth. It would mean that small and medium enterprises that were already struggling because of COVID would struggle a little bit more. So as a part of that thinking, they were opposed to any sort of negotiations with the IMF to obtain balance of payment support. IMF would typically come up with these kinds of policy adjustments to get us out of this crisis. So instead of that, we relied on import compression, on getting short-term swaps and credit lines from friendly countries, including China, India, Bangladesh, etc. But this process also is complicated because there are increasingly geopolitics of in this region. Sri Lanka's had a heavy sort of presence, Chinese presence over the last decade. It's sort of pitched us into regional and global sort of power rivalries that are being played out in the Indian Ocean. So even these negotiations were protracted. There were certain sort of strings attached to lines of credit that was being extended. So as negotiations dragged on, the currency crisis got even worse. And final, the death blow, I would say, is the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which saw oil prices shoot up exerting even more pressure on the limited resources that we had. So Sri Lanka's economic crisis, I mean, the policy mismanagement, I think, points to significant shortcomings in our institutions and governance structures. And this is something that, we've seen not only in this period, but through successive governments. We've tried to fix these problems, give the central bank more institutional independence in how it manages its affairs. But unfortunately, these things never go through. The central bank leadership tends to be political appointees, highly politicized. As a result, they're not able to give independent advice in terms of what needs to be done. And that sort of also erodes public confidence in economic management. The bureaucracy is also politicized. Again, Sri Lanka is not unique in that, but it also means that capacity for the technocracy to give sound advice has become really weakened over time, and that also contributes to kind of crisis that we are seeing. So by and large, economic policy management, it remains in the hands of a few, and accountability is almost non-existent. So combination of poor economic management as well as the institutional and governance weaknesses, I think, have brought us to this point. So the outlook for the rest of the year is also not really very good at all. Sri Lankan economy is expected to, we saw a bounce back from the COVID-19 contraction, but in 2022, growth is still going to be rather modest. The central bank estimates at about 1%. We'll be lucky if we get there, which means we're not going to see any new job opportunities being created. The national unemployment level is relatively low at about 5%, and that's not because jobs are being created, but because Sri Lanka is an aging population, so we have very limited numbers entering the labor force. But the big problem is youth unemployment. It's always been quite high, around 20-22%, and now it's going into the region of closer to edging up towards 30%. So this is a flashpoint for continued social unrest. We've, in the previous decades, had two youth insurrections, one in the 1970s and one in the 1980s. So Sri Lanka has, experiences of how these things can flare up and then drag on for years in the form of social unrest and conflicts. So my last point, and I'm just going to wrap it up here, just to give some background about what is the way forward and how is it going to be managed. Whichever way you look at it, it's very clear that social and political pressures will remain highly elevated in the coming months. We have to start imposing higher taxes, and that is the cornerstone of the IMF program that we are negotiating right now. And raising taxes, adding to the kinds of high inflationary pressures we are seeing is going to be politically fraught, even for governments that are at the peak of their popularity and perhaps at the early phase of their electoral cycle. So that's not certainly the case yet. We are midterm. The government popularity is perhaps at its lowest. How they will manage to convince the public at large to bear more sort of belt tightening is, I think, going to be a very, very difficult process, but we have no choice in that matter. Now, the next step of the IMF negotiations is to come to a staff level agreement and then debt restructuring. And we have defaulted on our foreign debt as of April, May. Again, there is no template on how long this will take, whether it's going to be a fairly short process, or whether it will drag on and be a prolonged process. There's a lot of complications in debt restructuring today, because we have a complex set of creditors. We have China, we have international bondholders. They are all looking to have comparable treatment. Whether China is willing to agree to a debt restructuring is still not clear, because China has a lot of creditors who are already seeking debt relief from them. So I think from the Chinese position is that if they provide debt relief to Sri Lanka, then they will also have to do so for these other creditors in Africa and other countries that are also going through some of these similar sort of problems. So the debt restructuring negotiations have to begin soon, and on the most optimistic estimate, we are thinking maybe 6 months before all of that gets finalized, and then the IMF executive board approval means that we will then have balance of payments. So the critical issue now is between now and the next 6 months, how do we manage the shortage of foreign exchange to ensure that the basic essentials are provided. We do away with the queues. The government is relying on the multilaterals, the World Bank, the ADB, as well as bilaterals to provide some amount of funding to get us through that. Again, if the situation in the next few months worsens, social, political challenges will be the biggest issue. I think for Sri Lanka right now, it's the politics really. That's the main area that needs some kind of resolution, because without a stable and political sort of the government with legitimacy, getting these kinds of reforms through and implementing them is going to be very, very tough. So I'll stop at that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dushni. I think if it's all right, I mean, I know there are people who probably would like to ask questions to you directly. We will go on directly to the next presenter and then come back for a round of discussion. We'll have a good, I think, 20 minutes at least for that. So I'll hand over to Dr. Jude, who might give us more insight also into the political situation, and maybe drawing on your own expertise, the implications for the inter-community, inter-ethnic religious harmony and reconstruction in the North. So I think there'll be a very useful complementarity in the presentations. Please, Dr. Jude. So perhaps also 10, 15 minutes, is that all right for you?
Thank you. Thank you, Jivanta. Thank you, Dushni. As Jivanta said, I would like to see the interlink between the political realm and the economic side of the crisis. Sri Lanka, since the colonial period, never had an independent capital. In the 80s, there was a classic book written by Sachi Ponnambalam called Dependent Capitalism. So the new ruling class and the main sectors of employment was based on this dependent capitalism. That's one. Compared with India, it was never ever independent in terms of capital generation. Second, it was a highly centralized state, which was ruled by this dependent elite capitalist class. There can be an independent capitalist class like in India, but in Sri Lanka, it was never existent. Third, it had a very, very strong racial ideology, particularly against the Tamils. And so this is, the basic, colonial structure which we never succeeded in overcoming and transforming. Okay. The second point is the current crisis. Now, because of the nature of the dependent capitalist structure, our exports never ever could be expanded to the level of increasing the income generated by the exports and reducing the expenditure on imports. There was relatively a national plan for self-sustaining economy between the 70 and 77, which was also full of contradictions. Now, tea, rubber, coconut, spices at the initial phase, and later garment, tourism, and then revenue earned from the migrant workers constituted our foreign exchange capacity. And then we converted this into bio-essential items such as food, medicine, and fuel. But year by year, as there was no proper national plan to boost the local economies, but a consistent national plan to strengthen the state through militarization, the export revenues dwindled year by year, slowly, some years more, some years less. Of course, these were boosted with tourism and garment industries, but it was never ever sustainable and could not really manage shocks like the pandemic or war conditions at all. Now, as a result, since 1965, 16 loans have been borrowed from the IMF, and the previous one was in 2006. As we all know, IMF want to slash the public expenditure, and that again affected subsidies given to the farmers, fisheries sector, education. But there was something consistently IMF didn't ask to do, cutting down defense budget, which has exceeded in terms of the population far beyond any country in South Asia. So you could see a consistent pattern in this. This is why I want to see this interrelationship between the state structure, its militarization, the economic crisis. None of these fields can be seen in isolation from each other. Now, at this moment, we see at least $35.5 billion in total as debts as of 2021 that has to be paid. As Dushni very rightly said, since 2007, Sri Lanka entered into a very predator debt borrowing system, that is international sovereign bonds. Now, 2007, please bear in mind, is a very crucial year, which many want to forget in Sri Lanka. I'll come to that later. Now, as it stands today, we can see out of total amount of foreign debt, international sovereign bond that constitute 47%, China only 10%, Japan 11%, ADB 9%, World Bank 9%, India 2%, and others 9%. Now, there's a popular myth about, how do you call debt trap diplomacy led by China. This is mostly what the United States want to put forward in encircling China in the Indian Ocean region. But when you look at the statistics, China's debts are very low than Eurobonds. So this is empirically quite misleading, in a way, to say China is the main culprit. Another reason given is the massive investment that China put into constructing of the Deep South Harbor, Hambantota. And it really was again leased out to China for 99 years. And the revenue of the lease was paid to Sri Lanka. It worth $1.12 billion. So Hambantota port fiasco is again not a serious issue that has caused this. And let me come to the main point I want to reiterate here. Singapore University South Asian Institute has done a very good research on how military expenditure increased year by year to the extent of creating a massive imbalance in the general expenditure budget of the Sri Lankan state. Now, we can see out of the national expenditure, 15% has been spent consistently on defense. Even during the COVID period, expenditure on health and education was reduced, and defense was increased. Out of this expenditure, 25% is spent on security-related jobs, which are recurrent payments. And in Sri Lanka, security sector employment jobs get a lot of increments. Now, this 25% of security-related job expenditure constitutes 50% of the state and public sector employment salaries. It's quite disproportionate. And why? Because the Southern polity believes the state has to be strengthened. And it was in 2007, the regime got a massive mandate against the Tamil Tigers, de facto state, and win the war. And no regime had got such a popular vote than this regime before. And it is within that immense power exercised by that regime, international capital sovereign bonds could be borrowed recklessly. And it increased year by year, as you know. So you could see the racist ideology, militaristic euphoria, the character of the state, military expenditure, and reckless power given to the elite are interconnected, which even the protesters on Goldface Green don't see, unfortunately. Therefore, to put forward a national plan, there is a difficulty in the country. Even on the civil society level, it's divided. Let's move a little bit forward, fast tracking. Expenditure on security sector increased even after war. Now, let me give some statistics from the report compiled by the Singapore National University. From 1983 to 1987, which we called Elam War 1, expenditure on defense was $421 million US. Elam War 2, 1990 to 1995, expenditure on defense increased to $766 million US. Elam War 3, 1995 to 2002, defense expenditure increased up to $1,346 million US. Now again, 2002 is the signing of the ceasefire agreement between the LTT and the Sri Lankan state. Now, I'm just putting quite a blunt statement. This has to be researched deeply, and I'm convinced this can be proven. Had the 2002 peace process succeeded, this crisis would not have happened. And there's empirical evidence. During the CFA, from 2002 to 2005, when there was the peace mandate, the defense budget decreased at least by $200 million US. It was $1,056 million US. Elam War 4, the last phase of the war, from 2006 to 2009, it increased to 1,499. Now, post-war period, it has come up to 1,716. And the result is, in some districts in the north, the the force density is 1 soldier to 6 civilians. Or there's a district called Mullaitivu, according to Matram Foundation report, the force density is 1 to 2. According to Economic and Social Weekly magazine of India, the force density in Jaffna is 1 to 10. 1 to 10. So this is just a snapshot of the depth of the crisis. And this is exactly why a national plan cannot be put forward even on the civil society level, bringing Tamils, Muslims, and Sinhalese together. Now, the Sinhalese who are deeply affected by the corruption of the Rajapaksa regime oppose the corruption of the regime, but cannot question, unfortunately, how they can become so corrupt, how they can be totally, totally unaccountable for. Okay, let me conclude here my comments. Sri Lanka, according to the UN reports, now again, the UN reports are discredited as being, white supremacy or Western supremacy. Even the UN can become a tiger supporting group, according to the ultranationalist groups in Sri Lanka. Now, there's total impunity. Forget about the Tamils. Whatever happens in the South, there's total impunity. So when you give total impunity to the criminal activities on the political level of killing people, financial crimes are already forgiven. Financial crimes are already forgiven. Okay. It's not rocket science, So the culture of impunity on the war front, on the level of direct human rights violations, excuses financial and economic crimes. Okay? This is the connection that those who protest in the South cannot understand. So in conclusion, there is I would say, I see these features now. The president depends on the military. And there are over 100 state and public sector institutions which come under military personnel, retired or existing. The president is not directly responsible to the parliament. That's the second point. He doesn't depend on the parliament. It's only as a measure of managing the crisis, he changed the parliament, agreed his brother's resignation. Third, there's a total disconnect between the parliament and the people on Goldface Green. Total disconnect. Why? They spent 3 days to debate who should be the deputy speaker. At a time, kids are dying because the parents cannot go to the hospital on time. Secondly, at the moment, they are debating in the parliament how to pay back to the politicians whose houses were burnt by angry mobs, how to get compensation. When people are queuing up for hours, some from midnight till early morning, for 2 or 3 liters or 1 liter of petrol or diesel. Okay, so there's a total disconnect. And where are we going to go forward? There was some kind of a promising light emerging from the lawyers group in Colombo, who were in a way putting forward a national plan. In a way, the lawyers were proposing it, coming to trade unions were proposing it. But there is also an issue here. There are no Muslims and Tamil civil society groups who are in this national plan. So my conclusion is, unless and until these different civil societies get together to put forward something stronger, the crisis might be temporarily averted through IMFC structuring, but it will soon reappear in more forceful ways. So we need to have short-term, medium-term, and long-term plans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jude Lal, also for a very forceful and clear presentation. I'm sure maybe just before we invite questions, I wonder if Dr. Dushni wants to come in to sort of take up some of the points that Dr. Jude has made, because he was able to pick up on points that you made in your presentation. And I wonder, how do you assess, his view, which is both historical and political, with your assessment? And I picked up one thing that you said about, because you gave us a very useful picture of the economics of the crisis, but you did mention policy blunders not so long ago. So how would you explain those policy blunders? Was it deep issues, institutional, structural issues that have really enabled the crisis? Were there political contingency factors that enable those policy blunders? Because I suppose now when one looks back, one just wonders, how was such decisions, how could they have been made, given the quality of Sri Lanka's intellectual elite, intelligentsia, bureaucrats? So how are those policy blunders possible?
Yes, I mean, I am trained as an economist, and I understand the presentation that was made by Jude was looking more at the through a very different lens. You can't, of course, separate the economics from the politics. Sri Lankan sort of economic policy making has been relatively weak over decades. And we have not quite managed to decide for ourselves whether we are more comfortable with a sort of inward-looking and protectionist kind of a policy environment, or as a small economy, whether we should be looking more as outwards, opening ourselves to global competition. So these are tensions that run through political parties. You tend to identify them as being very sort of aligned to the kinds of policies that the IMF will bring about, with a heavy dose of reliance on markets to drive economic policy, versus more populist, socialist kind of thinking. And the current government really came to power on that kind of a platform, a very populist platform, to say that we will protect our farmers, we will raise national production. And in some sense, it was a reaction to the previous sort of, 2016 to 2019, we were under an IMF program, huge tax increases, price-driven fuel formulas in place, pressures to trim subsidies and all of it. So, what we find is government to government, we tend to swing in our economic policy. So not much happens with a long-term view, because politicians simply come in and they're only thinking about the next 3-4 years before it's time to get ready for re-election. So in that interim, the institutional environment has really weakened. The politicization of the bureaucracy means that the appointments to these key positions, whether it is the central bank or whether it is the finance ministry or whether it is the economic advisors that the political leadership surrounds themselves with, they are only listening to one set of viewpoints, and any sort of counter views that are put forward, either you have to quietly depart from those positions, or you're completely shut down. So these are the governance institutional weaknesses. I mean, the central bank in particular has been weakened through appointments of either they are affiliated to the political party or actual politicians. The most recent central bank governor was a politician. He gave up his seat in parliament and came to the central bank. So, then it there is a sort of there's a credibility gap. And that's not only for Sri Lankans, but we are heavily exposed to foreign capital markets, etc., even foreign investors. Question, I mean, are we hearing the real story, or is this just more of spin doctoring of the real problem? So it's a problem, and I think in some sense perhaps the economic crisis has opened eyes of the politicians that something needs to change. The political class, irrespective of which party they are from, I think are all under watch. So they have a collective responsibility to put things right, because the weakening of institutions and governance in Sri Lanka is not just one party. It's been consistently through successive governments. We've seen it. I work, my institute, we are semi-government ourselves. We function under the Ministry of Finance, and we've been interacting with policymakers for a long time, and we see ourselves the weakening of capacity for independent decision making within the bureaucracy over time.
Thank you. I know we could go on with the discussion and conversation between the panelists, but there's been a couple of questions and a request from Dr. Ipshita Basu, who has to leave exactly at 11. So I'd just like to ask her question, and anyone else, please raise your hands or indicate via the chat. Ipshita?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jivanta, for organizing this talk. And hello, Dushni. Perhaps you remember me, we've been in touch before with the IDRC think tank initiative. So big hello from me. And really, thank you both actually for your very sort of pointed, reflections on what's going on with the Sri Lankan crisis. Unfortunately, I have to leave for another meeting in 7 minutes. But I think in such times of crisis, there is a huge amount of diagnostics that goes on. But I want to kind of take this opportunity to step back a bit and think that actually Sri Lanka is not alone also in going through this kind of, situation. And it's really the first in perhaps many other countries that might follow suit. But where I want to kind of bring this conversation towards is also the kind of trauma such a debt crisis causes for public opinion, and what implications that has in terms of attitudes, people's attitudes towards institutions, political leaders, and to each other. The reason I'm asking this question is because of the parallels I can see with the Greek debt crisis. And what I can understand is that long-term, besides, of course, coming out of the immediate issues of repaying debts and correcting the economy, is also the huge amount of public anxiety and resentment that is brewing. And of course, we can see that in Gulf phase at the moment. How much of that resentment is featuring really in people's thinkings in terms of how to build back better in future? Because obviously this has to change from resentment to hope, to better, political engagement. I think, there's a huge amount of lack of trust and big questions around how people are going to politically engage meaningfully. So just want to ask, my question really is, I suppose it's a weighted question, but really, this anger that people have, how do we shift that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm conscious everyone's time is very limited. So I promise not to keep the speakers longer than maybe another 10 minutes, if that's all right. So maybe Dr. Julal, do you want to take that question first? And then I'll ask Dr. Dushni.
Say the trauma is on the level of immense amount of hardships that people have to go through. But on the other hand, there's a positive aspect to the protests. The fear that the ordinary masses had against the Rajapaksa regime is gone now. So that's something that is positive. But again, let me qualify. The worship of the state and the military remains intact. So it is a recipe for another round of repression. So it's a paradox.
Dr. Dushni, would you have, I mean, the sense that it's at a crossroads, really, I suppose?
Yes, I mean, you can see from the all-party sort of proposals that's coming, and there is sort of movement to revisit the concentration of power in the executive presidency. This is something that, you know, we've gone back and forth, you know, some presidents who win always say, you know, I'm going to trim these powers once I am in office, but very rarely does it happen, because it's once you're in power, you don't really want to relinquish much of that. But now I think there is some sort of consensus building that we need to balance the sort of, you know, executive versus the parliament powers, and that will provide certain checks and balances in the way that the state functions. I think for the ordinary person right now, I know the political class and the more sort of the activist class is very much engaged in pushing the political reforms through. But for the ordinary man and woman on the street, it's about, you know, dealing with the cost of living and getting their hands on the essentials, on gas. I mean, Sri Lanka there's a generation in Sri Lanka that has never seen queues, so have had to undergo this. Those of us of an older generation, I think we've gone through much sort of, you know, periods in which we've had shortages but certainly nothing of this scale. So you know, there is a lot of debate and discussion whether the kinds of public protests that we've been seeing, some of it get generated, you know, automatically, but some of it has been hijacked by political parties, trade unions, etc. Will it be sustained, or once the some relief is provided in terms of easing these queues and you know, getting people off, will the demand for change also sort of die down? So we don't know. I mean, the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister just said he's coming he's going to announce a relief budget. And I think even though there is an IMF related economic tightening, there is a recognition that there is a large chunk of you know, the poorer sections who need to be provided better social safety net, security, etc. So the World Bank also is coming with some assistance. So I don't know to what extent the current political demands for political change, how they will manifest, because at the moment, for the vast majority, I think it's still economics. The politicians may, you know, gather together in parliament and debate these things, but the reality of day-to-day managing sort of cost of living and finding essentials, that's preoccupying us at the moment.
I hope that answered a little bit Ipshita's question. I suppose that parallel with the Greek debt crisis might be something interesting to look at. I suppose each time when one is in the midst of a crisis, it feels it's the moment of collapse and disintegration. And yet, I mean, you've mentioned the question of institutions. The resources of resilience are also perhaps sometimes very surprising. So let's hope that the resilience comes through. There was one specific question in the chat from a colleague who's recently got her PhD on development aid and India's role. And she asks, I'll ask it for her if that's okay. She was asking specifically about remittances and that having been a very important part, I suppose, of Sri Lanka's finances and why that seems to have dried up. Was that mostly to do with COVID, Dr. Dushni?
Actually, no. Remittances, in fact, did better in 2020 compared to 2019 against all expectation. And then that's because remittance also is a coping mechanism. So it has a sort of a counter-cyclical, when there's economic downturn, remittances tend to go up. Now, in 2021, the real reason why we've seen remittances shrinking is because of the management of the exchange rate. The central bank decided they're going to fix the exchange rate at 200 rupees to the a dollar, and a black market emerged. So most migrants, I think there is a sense that they are still sending the money, but they're not sending it through formal banking channels, because there was some, if you can get 50, 60, 70 rupees more to a dollar by using these formal channels, which migrant workers are anyway very familiar with. Why would you send it through the formal channel? So again, pretty much a blunder on the part of the central bank to understand the dynamics of how these things work. If you start to control one thing, it disincentivizes the very thing that you're trying to raise, and that's foreign earnings into the country.
Thank you. Rachna, was there anything else you wanted to follow up on, or anybody else had a specific question?
No, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Otherwise, if I may just pick up on one point, since we have you here, and I won't keep you much longer. Dr. Jude referred to China, and that is, of course, something that grabs everyone's attention. And you put it very strongly that there's been a sort of hysteria around debt diplomacy, and seeing Sri Lanka as this perfect example. And wrongly so, in your opinion. So, but is it at all the case? I mean, again, not knowing the details, but that the interest rates are much higher when it comes to Chinese investment and agreements with Sri Lanka compared to the other sources? And what about, since you mentioned militarization and the defense budget, I mean, hasn't China also played a role in that sector of having become a big arms supplier? So, I mean, just your assessment of the Chinese factor in the situation now, or more generally, Sri Lanka's dilemma, like also Dr. Dushni very correctly pointed out, this dilemma of looking inwards, being self-sufficient, looking outwards, and getting involved in all these global geopolitics.
Yeah, I think a year ago, Chatham House published a working paper. Chatham House is London-based, and they are not pro-Chinese. I'm just putting it blunt. But it is a very, very objective one in their terms. They said the Chinese debt trap diplomacy is a myth. So please get hold of that paper. I think those of you who really want to go for a balanced analysis. Now, as everybody knows, China is trading. It's through its one road, one belt, policy. It's trading and investing. And as I very clearly showed, it's the sovereign bonds in this current crisis which has, created havoc more than Chinese investments. Okay, that's number one. Secondly, when it comes to arms trade, Jivanta, China didn't supply arms very recently. China has been supplying arms since 1970s. That has been recurring. Okay? Now, the next point, Islamabad provided, Iran gave, Israel gave, Slovakia gave, Israel gave. So you find a cohort of arms suppliers. Chinese ones are bigger. That's true. Of course, Israel sold over 20 Israeli-made Kafir jets with the permission of the US, which were extremely destructive. So aerial bombing. So now the question here is, this is where again I want to connect it, I'll cut short, it to the economic argument and the political argument. The Sri Lankan state is extremely unitary, as everybody knows, because of its geostrategic, because of the geostrategic importance of the island. The state has to be, for the powers that be, unitary. And that was exactly why the political space for 2002 peace process was destroyed, not by China necessarily, but by the UK, USA mainly. And of course, India followed suit. And once the political space was destroyed for a peaceful negotiation of the conflict, of course, supported heavily by the European Union, which didn't have military interest in Sri Lanka as the UK and USA had, very clearly. China does not have direct military interest except economic interest. So once the political space was destroyed for military interest in the Indian Ocean by the UK and USA, of course, India is on their side at the moment through Quad and all that against China. Then the need, of course, then Sri Lanka became the marketplace for every arms trader, including China. So that's why I want to lay emphasis more on the political space. Who has power at the end of the day makes the decision. So that's how I want to put it across, because economy as such, like it doesn't act as the unseen hand of God. It's a political decision at the end of the day. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's rare, I think, to have someone who can talk politics and talk economics on the same panel and to precisely bring out both the divergent perspectives and yet how the two sides are so completely interconnected and intertwined. And I think both of you are very open-minded in your disciplinary perspectives to be able to engage in this conversation. So, from my perspective, I would have loved to go on and on with the conversation and to find ways of drawing out both of your perspectives, but I completely understand you must be terribly busy, and I'm sure there are a lot of requests for your time and expertise. So if there are no more questions from the audience, I will bring this to a gradual close. Maybe the last final question to Dr. Dushni is, what happens next? What exactly is right now happening? Just to give us a sense of, what does a country do in this situation? So they have to now talk to the IMF, and that comes first, and then they're talking to the other countries to restructure their debt, or maybe you just give us a sense of what's happening right now, and then we'll close.
Yes, so the talks with the IMF, that's been going on, but it was being held back because we didn't have a finance minister until yesterday. So because some of these IMF negotiations have to be, they need parliamentary approval, they need a finance minister to sign off on this. So that was the major constraint. And now the PM is also acting as the finance minister, so it will proceed. So once the the expectation is that at least a staff level agreement will be done fairly quickly, within a month, 2 months. And in the interim, the debt restructuring talks will start. Sri Lanka has just appointed external experts on the legal and financial as advisors. The difficulty thereafter is in getting the bondholders. This is a dispersed set of bondholders, mostly US based. And then you have China. I agree with what Jude said. I mean, if you look at the numbers, this whole China debt diplomacy became a sort of a, Sri Lanka became a poster child for that. It's not really the true picture, but China is still the single largest bilateral lender to Sri Lanka. And along with the bondholders, China, India, and Japan are the three key players that will be involved in the debt restructuring talks. The multilaterals really don't take on board any debt restructuring. So the question is, China has a different model. It says, we will give you another loan to refinance the debt that you owe. That means they are not willing to take a haircut or cut in that, the principal amount. So if we are asking the bondholders to take a haircut, then of course there is this issue of comparable treatment. Will bondholders agree to that? So, look at Zambia. Zambia has a large share of its debt in sovereign bonds, and then China is its largest bondholder, bilateral creditor. And Zambian debt restructuring talks have dragged on for about 2 years because they had to sort of, bring China in. So the legal and financial advisors that we have appointed are ones who dealt with the Zambian case. So there's a learning curve and we need not spend so much time. So that will be sort of the preoccupation over the next 3, 4, 5 months to get the debt restructuring done. And that will not only provide some relief in terms of foreign exchange, but also it is a signal to multilaterals that something is happening, and it's that they can release some funding that's in the pipeline for key sort of priority sectors. I mean, in one, just the last point on the China, India, sort of, what's happening here. We asked China for debt relief early on, but there was no real positive response. I mentioned why earlier. And India has really stepped up in a big way. And there's a lot of, that India is making up for lost ground. Because over the last decade, they were very slow to act, and China was overtaking India in terms of its political influence as well as its economic influence here. But now you see there is a slight change in that relationship. India has stepped up with almost 5 billion of assistance so far, and that's huge. So, it also means that it's not just a domestic economic crisis, but our international relations and diplomacy and all of it is also seeing a bit of a shift along with it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Judlal, any last
No, thank
comments?
you, Jivanta. That's fine. Thank you
so much. You've opened up lots of ideas for future sessions on the role of external actors. I think, we'd be really fascinated to pursue that further. So I hope we can interact with you again in the future and draw on you to join our events. Jude is, of course, in Dublin, so I hope we'll actually be able to meet soon. And Dr. Dushni, if you're ever coming this side to this part of the world, perhaps you let us know and we could invite you over. But again, on behalf of the Ireland India Institute and my colleagues, thank you so very much. You've given us a lot of food for thought and great insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. It was a pleasure to
Thank you for organizing.